Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about something that I've been meaning to make a video about for a long time, the UK water industry, because the UK decided back in 1989 to privatise all of its water companies. And water is a monopoly. You don't have any choice whatsoever in terms of who supplies your water and who deals with all of your sewage. You just have to take whichever company runs the area that you live in. And the UK decided that it was a good idea to privatise a monopoly where there is absolutely no competition whatsoever. And that has proved to be a complete shambles. And there is now a public outcry where a lot of people are saying that the water industry needs to be nationalised again. It needs to be put back into public ownership. And when you look at what's happening around the rest of the world, there are very few countries that have a privatised water system because it's the basic essence of human existence. You need water to survive, you have to drink it. And in the UK, we have potable water, so you can drink it straight from the tap. It's 100% safe. And obviously, in order to make water 100% safe, it has to go through a treatment process, and that's expensive. And also in the UK, potable water is used in the sewers. So basically, when you flush your toilet, it uses the same water that you would use to drink. So that's obviously quite an expensive substance to be flushing your toilet with, but that's the way the system works. And if we look back at what happened in 1989, the UK was split up into 10 different companies. Thames Water, Severn Trent, Anglian Water, Yorkshire Water, Southern Water, United Utilities, which was previously called North West Water, Wessex Water, Northumbrian Water, Welsh Water, which now has a Welsh name, and South Western Water. And you can see the map here of where all of those businesses are based. And Thames Water is the biggest out of all of the water suppliers. It covers the London region, which obviously has a huge population. And that company is basically on the verge of bankruptcy. It actually posted a £1.6 billion loss, which is close to $2 billion in 2024. And the reason for that was because it's being run very badly. And you can see that some of the biggest costs that were put through the books in 2024 included the write-off of an internal loan that the company decided it was impossible to repay. It doesn't have $1.3 billion to repay that. Financing costs of almost $300 million. Fines that it's been given because it's been underperforming compared to what it's meant to be doing. And the chief executive of the company recently asked the UK government if it was okay for them to waive those £120 million of fines because he can't afford to pay it. Well, obviously the whole point of having a fine system in place is to fine companies that aren't doing what they're meant to do, the provision of water predominantly. And then we've got consultancy fees and turnaround costs. And a report was recently commissioned and posted on the 21st of July into the independent water supply in the UK. And that report was fairly damning, basically saying that most of the companies are not delivering on what they should be doing. Now, in terms of the number of customers that each of these companies supply, Thames Water is the biggest with 15 million, followed by Severn Trent with 8 million, United Utilities 7.3, Anglian 7, Yorkshire 5, Southern Water 4.6, and Northumbrian 4.5. And then we've got the smaller ones at the bottom. And I thought it was worth having a quick look at this chart, which shows the countries that have 100% drinkable water. So you can see here this has got a sliding scale. So the ones that are hitting that 100% mark are Finland, Germany, Greece. So anyone who's been on holiday to Greece, you can drink from the tap, according to this chart. Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, the USA. So you can drink from the tap in the USA. Norway, Luxembourg, and Canada, and Iceland. They're all the ones that have a 100% ratio. We then have Australia, which is just under 100%, Austria, Portugal, Sweden, Spain. Not many people I know drink from the tap in Spain, but it's better than it is in Belgium, Israel, Denmark, the Netherlands, South Korea, Slovenia, France, Slovakia, New Zealand, surprisingly quite low down this list, Latvia, Chile, Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, Japan, Czech Republic, Hungary, Costa Rica, Turkey, Colombia, and it's probably not advisable to drink the water from the tap in Mexico because they're at the very bottom of this chart. But the reason I wanted to show this is that it's one of the legal obligations for all of these water companies in the UK to make sure that the water that is coming out of the taps is drinkable. And obviously, what they have to do is take rainwater and make sure they've removed all the impurities and any bacteria and things that could cause problems for human health. Now, in terms of the privatisation process back in 1989, the government was looking to raise money by selling off lots of different companies. And it had sold British Gas, which supplied, it was the monopolistic business that ran all of the gas in the UK. So it sold that one. And then it sold a couple of other not so successful ones, British Steel and British Leyland. British Steel was obviously the steel business. British Leyland was making vans and not doing particularly well. And those IPOs didn't go well. So off the back of that, it was decided that the water companies needed to be boosted. They needed to be really attractive to make sure that the IPOs were successful. So we had some regulation that was put into place that was meant to cover what was going on in these companies going forward. And then we had a whole different system put in place in terms of how the government was going to control how these companies operated. But in terms of what the government did to fluff these companies up to make them a bit more attractive, they wrote off around £5 billion worth of debt. And this was 1989. So the dollar equivalent of that today would probably be somewhere in the region of 20 billion, something of that nature. They then gave the companies £1.5 billion in grants to help with infrastructure going forward. And they gave them tax concessions. But the main thing that they did was reduce the value of the company when they sold them onto the markets to make sure that it was an attractive purchase. And if we look at this chart, it shows the IPO valuation. So they're basically what the companies were valued at the time when they were sold off, when the shares were sold to the general public in the UK back in 1989. So you can see that Thames Water, the IPO valuation was 1.3 billion. However, when it was acquired off the public markets by RWE in 2001, so 12 years later, RWE paid a valuation of 4.3 billion, so around about more than 3 times more than the UK government had valued it at. And they then sold it on to the private equity firm Macquarie from Australia 5 years later for 8 billion. And the reason why it was sold for such a high number wasn't because RWE had invested a huge amount into new infrastructure. They didn't do that at all. They basically just made a huge profit because they knew that 4.3 billion, which was the market value at the time, was less than what the company was worth. And then they were able to sell it at market value for 8 billion to Macquarie. So what that shows us is that the UK government undervalued the Thames Water business significantly to make sure that it was a successful flotation. And if you look at the rest of the companies on this chart, it's a similar story. Anglian Water was floated for around 600 million valuation, and it was then subsequently acquired by Osprey Consortium in 2006 for 2.2 billion. So again, about 3.5 times the value that was given by the UK government. Now, interestingly, Severn Trent and United Utilities are still listed, so I don't think they're big enough to be that attractive to the big overseas consortiums. But you can see the other ones here. Southern Water was floated for 600 million. It was acquired by Greensland Holdings for 4.2 billion, which is a lot more than 600 million. Yorkshire Water floated at 700 million, sold for 3 billion. Northumbrian Water floated for 500 million, sold for 2.2 billion. Wessex Water floated for 300 million, sold for 1.2 billion. And Welsh Water floated for 500 million and then sold for £1. Not-for-profit company because it was basically not doing very well by that stage. Now, I wanted to have a quick look at what's going on with Thames Water, because they've come under a lot of scrutiny recently. There's been a lot of complaints about Thames Water. And basically, the company is now completely illiquid. It's bankrupt. It's bust. It got bailed out by the UK government recently. They gave it an additional loan. But essentially, this company is on the verge of collapse. And the chief executive recently said that unless it gets another bailout, it won't survive and it will have to be nationalised. And this isn't a positive nationalisation. This isn't the UK government saying, well, this would be quite a nice asset. We think it should be back under public ownership. We think that would be helpful for everybody and profitable for the UK government. This is basically the lender of last resort, the UK government stepping in because the current owners don't want to keep running it because it's making huge losses. And obviously, it's a public service. Everybody needs water. Everybody needs sewage. They need to be able to flush their toilets, to have a shower, have a bath, all of those sorts of things. So somebody has to run it. And obviously, the government will have to step in the same way as they did with British Steel recently, because British Steel was about to go bust and the Japanese owners said that they were going to close it down. Sorry, Chinese owners said they were going to close it down. And it was the last remaining virgin steel production in the UK, which is needed for the defence sector. So the government had to step in, and basically they're now paying a fortune every day to run that company. And Thames Water is in a very similar situation. I want to just have a look at what's happened to Thames Water, how it got to that stage. So, as we've just seen, it was privatised back in 1989 at a valuation of 1.3 billion, then acquired by a German company for 4.3 billion. So, significant increase against the 1989 valuation. They then sold it on to Macquarie, the private equity firm, for 8 billion in 2006. Macquarie then sold it. They exited and sold for 10 billion. So they made a £2 billion profit. So all these overseas companies are making a very healthy profit from the sale of Thames Water. They've exited with a large amount of money. However, in 2024, it was announced that the company was in financial crisis, unable to raise new equity, and was basically defaulting on its debt. It's now been placed into a potential special administration with an estimated cost to the UK taxpayer of between 10 and 15 billion pounds. So that's significant amount of money, certainly a lot more than the 1.3 billion that was raised back in 1989. And one of the reasons why Thames Water has got itself into such difficulty is because all of these water companies were allowed by the regulator to take on debt, to gear up. And you can see from this chart the movement in the level of gearing between 1995 and 2024. So the privatisation took place in 1989. There wasn't any gearing at that point. There was no debt. However, all of these companies then started taking on debt. And basically what they did is borrowed money from the banks against the value of their assets. And their assets were things like the water pipelines, the sewage pipelines, the sewage treatment works, the water treatment works, reservoirs, those sorts of things. So basically assets that previously had been owned by the state, now put into private ownership and now being taken on in terms of lots of debt. And you can see that the gearing levels for all of these different companies rose from somewhere in the region of 10 to 20% in 1995. So that had been put in place in the 6 years since privatisation, to over 90% for some of these businesses by 2006. And you can see that the gearing levels have stayed somewhere between 60 and 80% for the majority of these companies since that time. So that is a significant amount of debt that those companies have taken on. Of course, when you take on debt, you have to pay the interest on that debt. There is a cost associated with it. And if we look at the current levels of debt, we look at the gearing for all of these companies, you can see that Thames Water is right at the top of this list. It has $16.8 billion worth of debt. So when you think about the UK government sold this company for 1.3 billion, they sold it onto the public markets with no debt. Since that time, the owners of the company have raised $16.8 billion of debt. So where's that money gone? Well, we'll come on to talk about that in a second. So 16.8 billion against the $20 billion of assets that the company has. So that gives it a gearing ratio of 84%. So basically, it's almost borrowed 100% of the asset value, which is like incredible. And it's the highest debt in this sector. But we've got 73% gearing for Southern Water. They've got 6.2 billion of debt compared with 8.5 of assets. Yorkshire Water has 66% gearing, 4.3 billion of debt. Severn Trent 65, as has United Utilities. Anglian 63, Northumbrian and 64, Wessex Water 66, South East Water 60, and the Welsh Water Company, despite the fact that it was worth only £1 recently, has 58% gearing. So that's a lot of debt. When you add up all of this debt, we're talking tens of billions of dollars of debt that's been raised by the new owners of all of these companies. And one of the reasons why they've been raising debt was to pay themselves heavy dividends. So the new owners of all of these businesses, so some of them are listed on the public market, so they're shares that you could buy, or it's been overseas companies buying them like Macquarie and RWE. They've been buying them and then paying themselves massive dividends. So you can see that since privatisation, Anglian Water has paid out £12.6 billion in dividends. Thames Water has paid out 10.4 billion. And if we go back to that debt chart, you can see that Thames Water has taken on 16.8 billion of debt and paid out 10.4 billion in dividends. So that 16 billion wasn't for the good of the infrastructure. This wasn't to help Thames Water improve everything and make sure that it was operating efficiently and make sure that all of the pipes worked properly. This was basically funding the dividends. And if we look at the rest of the companies on this list, you can see that Severn Trent paid 6.8 billion, United Utilities 7.5, Yorkshire 5, Southern Water 4.5, South West Water 4, Northumbrian 3.5, Wessex 3, South East 2.5, and the Welsh company hasn't paid any because it doesn't have any money to pay it out. But the point of really highlighting what I'm highlighting here is that these companies raised huge amounts of debt and then paid the money away in dividends rather than doing what they were meant to do in terms of making sure that all of the infrastructure was up to date, well invested, and therefore not going to cause any problems. And if we look at the return on capital for these businesses, dating back to 1989, you can see at that point of privatisation, the companies had a return on equity of somewhere between 7% and 17%. So that was a very healthy spread. However, over the past 30 years, there has been a significant reduction on the return in equity. And the most recent data shows that that's now down to a maximum of 10% for some of these businesses, but actually many of them are now falling into negative territory. So the return on equity has fallen significantly as a result of the fact that many of these businesses are no longer making a profit. They're having to spend lots of money on infrastructure and repairing all of the pipes and the reservoirs and all of those sorts of things. And there is now a public outcry from many people in the UK saying that the UK government needs to step in and put these businesses back into public ownership. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because, as I said, I've been thinking about making it for a long time because I think what's happened in the UK water industry is a good example of what not to do with a monopolistic business. Most businesses have competition. When you start up a business, there will be lots of other companies doing similar things to what you're doing. However, when a business is set up to supply water to people's homes, obviously you don't really want to have competition for that because it doesn't make any sense. The system was set up hundreds of years ago in the UK. We've got the sewer systems that were introduced back in the 1800s, and they haven't really been updated that much since that time. And we've got the water pipes and the reservoirs, and obviously the infrastructure is limited in supply. So it makes sense for the government to run it and to operate it the most efficient way that they can. However, back in the 1980s, the decision was made that these businesses were a really good idea to privatise them, to put them into public ownership. Now, at the time, all of them were listed and UK residents were given the opportunity to apply for shares. If you were a customer of a certain water company, you could apply. And many people bought shares and made a profit. And everybody was happy that they'd made a few £100 profit. However, the problem that you have is that once you put a company into public ownership, so you basically list it on the stock markets, you don't control what happens to it thereafter. And what we've seen in the UK is that overseas investors have seen these businesses as being very attractive because they've got a monopoly, so customers can't really do anything about it. Now, obviously, there are rules and regulations in place in terms of how much you're able to increase the prices. The price caps are in place, and there's links to inflation, and there are obligations in terms of repairing everything and making sure everything works. But as we've seen in today's video, there is the opportunity to raise debt against what was previously unencumbered assets. So the companies that bought these businesses basically picked up things that were asset heavy. They had lots of infrastructure that was valuable and obviously could be leveraged. And then those companies decided that they were going to take on huge amounts of debt, tens of billions of pounds, and use that money to pay out dividends to themselves and also to pay very healthy salaries and bonuses to all of the people who are working in the businesses. So that was very nice for them. But the problem for UK consumers is that the companies haven't been investing sufficiently enough into the infrastructure. And it was recently reported that serious water pollution incidents are up 60% in England, this is the obligation of the water companies to make sure that there's not huge amounts of sewage flowing out into all of the rivers in the UK. And it was also announced that at the same time as the performance is falling, that water bills for the next tax year will rise by 26%. Now that is obviously significantly above inflation, which is sitting at around 3%. And if we look at the actual pound value of those increases, Thames Water, which is the biggest of all of the water companies and the one that is effectively bankrupt, it's increasing its average price from £488 per year to £639. That is a massive increase. However, it isn't the most expensive. Southern Water has come in as the most expensive company. It's increased its price from £478 to £703 per year. And that is eye-watering in terms of that increase. So nobody is happy with the performance of these companies. Nobody's happy with the fact that many of them are owned by overseas investment companies that have taken billions and billions of pounds of dividend payments. And also, in many cases, they've made a huge profit buying and selling these companies and then walking away from them, leaving the UK government to pick up the pieces. So the overall summary of today's video, and the point of making it, was really just to highlight the fact that the UK was one of the first countries in the world to decide to privatise what was essentially a national public service, something that everybody relies upon who lives here, the provision of water and the provision of sewage facilities. They privatised that to make a small profit back in 1989. However, since that time, the ownership of these companies has traded hands many times. The new owners have taken billions and billions of pounds out of those companies in terms of dividends. They've increased the amount of debt exponentially. There is a huge amount of debt now sitting on all of these balance sheets. And essentially, the owners can walk away and leave the UK government to pick up the pieces, because everybody still needs to be able to flush their toilet and take a shower and have a drink from the tap. Somebody needs to foot the bill for that. And unfortunately, it's going to be the UK government. And the way that they're going to fund it is by increasing taxes and other ways of raising money from UK residents. So all of this is bad news if you're living in the UK and you want to still have water. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you for that. And if you've signed up as either a Patreon or a YouTube member or a Buy Me a Coffee member, really appreciate that long-term support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.
Come here. Come here. You almost did. Oh my god. One more step. You got it. Whee!